Hey everyone, in the VC, it's Matt, and I'm still off from work this week, so I figured might just do some more Beatles solo reviews. And having finished up Paul McCartney's albums yesterday, at least until September when the new album comes out, I figured for no particular reason I would move on to George Harrison. So we come to his first album, which came out in England on November 1st of 1968 and December 2nd of the same year in America. It didn't chart at all in England, but it got to number 49 in America, so I guess that's okay. And of course, I'm talking about Wonderwall Music, which is the soundtrack to a film by the same name. This is the first album ever on Apple Records, their new at the time label, and considered by many to be the first Beatles solo album, even though it depends on whether you want to count Family Way by McCartney or not from 1966. But this is my copy. I'm not sure if this is an American or British copy. It came out in mono in England only, and stereo in mono. Stereo in mono in England, and only stereo in America. This is a stereo copy, so it might be a US, it might be a British copy. Anyway, this is the cover. Love the cover. It's one of my favorite George album covers, and it's one of my favorite album covers. So you got the English guy in his bowler hat and tweed suit there, separated from kind of a East and West culture, separated by distance and misunderstanding in the wall with the one brick missing there. So there's hope of some kind of meeting of the minds, I guess. On the back picture, which is actually upside down when you flip it from the front, is a picture of the Berlin Wall. So there's it right side up. So that's that, and that's the cover. This is actually, this is one of my favorite George albums. So let's just start with that. It's kind of an early example, one of the earliest examples of a rock star or a pop star with world music. So you've got a lot of George, of course, a few years earlier got interested in India and the sitar and Eastern thought and philosophy and religion, and you had a lot of that on Beatle albums already with Norwegian Wood and the songs on Revolver and Within You and Without You on Pepper. And so you get some more of that, but you also get a lot of Western music and I guess Eastern or world music. So he's an early forerunner of that, and of course others would go on to do this later. Paul Simon with the Graceland album in the 80s, which wasn't really a very good album, but wasn't Mickey Hart with the Grateful Dead. I think Peter Gabriel and some others had done this, but the Beatles, no surprise, were there first. George was there first, and this was recorded in London and in studios in London and in a studio in Bombay, India, with the Indian musicians. The Inner Light, the Beatles song, that's the flip side of Lady Madonna, was recorded during the Bombay sessions, and was used as held over and used as the Beatle track for that 45. There's always been some question as to whether George actually plays on this album or not. He composed the music. From what I've read, he watched the film and just sort of the different parts of the film. He came up with the ideas for the music and got the various musicians who play on the various tracks in various studios. But apparently he does play maybe piano, mellotron, and some guitar on this. Earlier years, it was thought that he just sort of composed the music and had the musicians brought into the studio and kind of supervised the recordings. But I think he probably does play on probably quite a bit on this. There's also the Remo 4, which was an old Mercy Beat British invasion band that had toured with the Beatles back in 63, 64. They play on this. Eric Clapton is on here. Ringo Starr. Peter Tork from the Monkees shows up, even though I'm not sure he's on the finished album because there was quite a bit of music that he composed for the film, and apparently not all of it made the soundtrack album. I've seen the film once years ago. It's kind of a gobbledygook, just the usual sort of fuzzy-headed hippie, weird, out there type movies that were made in that period, that 67, 68 period. I remember enjoying it okay. The main thing about it is that Jane Birkin's star is cute and fun to look at. Not a great movie. It's sort of something like along the lines of like Magical Mystery Tour or something, where it's got its moments, but it's hardly what you call great filmmaking. But I do quite. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. I do love this album. This is one of my favorite George albums of his solo work, and so we'll get into the various tracks in a minute. This is, like I said, I'm not sure if this is an American or a British copy. Came out in stereo and mono in England, but only in stereo in America, and this is a stereo copy, so it could be either one, and I'm not sure how you tell. I used to have, this is my second copy of this. The first copy I got was a Japanese pressing back in like 1977, and that actually had a gatefold, and it had an inner sleeve with a insert with a picture of George. This is just the album cover, no gatefold, and here's of course, the first record on Apple Records there. But I'm thinking that inner sleeve, I got this at a used record store several years ago, and that's probably not the original inner sleeve that came with it. I'm thinking could be, but I'm thinking not. So I don't have the insert with the picture. So yeah, the insert was a picture taken by Astrid Kircher. Never was sure how to say her name, but the girl in Hamburg, the group of people that befriended the Beatles when they were playing in Hamburg before they were famous, that took all the famous black and white shots of them back in 60, 61 or so. So she took the 68 insert picture, which I didn't know. That's kind of interesting. I wasn't sure that they were still really in touch with her at that point. But yeah, world music and this shows. This is an album that I really like. It's one of my favorite of George's, like I said. But I'm going to qualify that because it's one that a lot of times kind of gets overlooked and forgotten. A lot of times it gets lumped in with the experimental albums of George, like Electronic Sound and the John Life with Lions Wedding album, Two Virgins albums. And it's really not that. This is actual tunes and music and melodies. It's not just a bunch of out there, avant-garde, strange, weird, sort of noodling around oddball stuff like those other albums are. So this is true music, but it's also the kind of album that a lot of people would probably listen to and think, well, it's just boring, or they would listen to and think, well, it's pretty and it's nice, but it's also boring. So it's then there's others I think that would really get into this, and I guess that's the camp I fall into. This isn't pop songs. This isn't commercial radio single hit type songs. It's an album that you kind of have to delve into and discover, and over time, and it's kind of a journey and an adventure, and it functions well as a movie soundtrack if you've ever seen the movie, and even if you haven't, it's a great mix of sort of Western music and Eastern music, and I guess it also depends on how much you like George's Indian music with the Beatles, the cuts off of Revolver, the use of the sitar on Norwegian Wood, Within You Without You from Pepper, that sort of thing. And when I was younger, I wasn't crazy about those songs. Well, Norwegian Wood I loved, but but as far as his just straight up Indian songs. But later on, as I got older, they kind of grew on me, and I came to appreciate them more, uh, especially in this when they're like 2 3 minute songs. I don't still when I listen to Indian music when it's like a whole album of it or something, I get bored with it pretty quick. But a lot of these songs, I think, are just the longest song. I think is like 4 or 5 minutes, but there's a lot of minute and a half songs because they are the purpose of them is for movie soundtrack for little bits of the different bits of the film, and so they're pretty short snippets. It's even some cases it's hard to kind of determine where one song ends and one the next begins on this album. Not always, but in certain cases. But like I said, it works fine as just an album experience by itself, and it really is a good mix of a lot of different styles of music. And I think it shows that George, you know, especially at this point, was still considered the little brother of John and Paul, or the junior executive Beatle who showed up with his 1 or 2 songs per album, and John and Paul were geniuses that did all the heavy lifting. But things like this really go a long way to show just how incredibly talented he was. And had he been, in any other band but the Beatles, he would have been the main guy. And so, not to take anything away from John and Paul, but it's just, to me, just shows what a huge talent he was. So, yeah, I love this album, but like I said, it's one that give a listen to because you're either going to find it boring or just okay, or you're going to really get into it and love it. It's not a readily accessible thing like, say, All Things Must Pass or something along those lines. But yeah, so let's go through the songs real quick. The first song is called Microbes. It's Indian music that sort of sounds like bagpipes at the time. It's a haunting, sort of mournful piece of music at times. Sounds like a little musical conversation, and there's very few. There's no straight ahead vocals or songs with lyrics on this album. There are some vocals in a couple of the songs that are in the background, and some of them I think are vocals taped and played backwards and so forth throughout the music. But most of these songs don't have any songs or pieces of music, I guess, don't have any vocals. But Microbes is a good way to start the album, and give it a 9. The second song is Red Lady 2, which switches from Indian music to sort of a very beautiful Victorian era London piece of classical music. Sort of doesn't sound like, but sort of in the same vein as Lady Jane by the Rolling Stones. So of course this has no lyrics. But Red Lady 2 is a great one. I'm going to give that a 10. We go back to Indian music. It's third piece of music. I'm not sure what they call these songs or pieces of music. Is Tabla and Pakavaj. Probably not saying that wrong. Right. Not saying that wrong. It's a nice tabla drum beat with a sort of a sitar buzz over it. Little reminds you of Within You, Without You at times. Nice little short song. It's gets a 9 from me. We go to In the Park. This is fourth song on side one. One of the longer songs is 4 minutes and 8 seconds. It's Indian music, but it almost sounds like Chinese music at times, and it's pretty, but it goes on too long and it gets tedious pretty quick. So I'm only going to give that one a 6. But then we go to the fifth song, which is Drilling a Home, which is I love the blah ending, beginning of it, just the weird sound effect at the beginning. Then it goes into this sort of old western town. You picture in your head honky-tonk piano playing that's sort of like a Benny Hill Keystone Cops silent movie soundtrack, kind of silly, funny pianos that's sped up. The horns come in and add to the comedy feel or effect of the piece. It's it's just there's a frantic nature to the song, like it's a chase scene or something, and then it goes into this sort of Dixieland horns come in, and the song speeds up and has these weird sort of pause and gaps and unexpected time changes in it, and it's like an old Western Dixieland Keystone Cops weird psychedelic piece of music, and it again just shows the brilliance of George, and it shows that you know George was, when it came to psychedelic music, he was right up there. You know, maybe John Lennon was the best of the four, but George was probably the second best, and really close to John Lennon's level when it came to this type of music. So Drilling at Home is a great one. It gets a 10. Greasy Legs is a funny title, but it's more Indian music. Not much to it, but it's nice and good solid little piece of music. I give it an 8. Then we go into Skiing. I guess that's how you pronounce it. It's SKI hyphen ING. It's really great, just kind of a acid rock, hard rock song. There's a blast of this fuzz tone psychedelic guitar, courtesy of Eric Clapton. It sounds kind of like Cream a little bit because he would have been, that was his band at the time. And so, Eric Clapton being the third best guitarist in the Yardbirds, he does pretty well here, you gotta say. And it kind of loops back and forth on itself, and just a great song. Skiing gets a 10. Then we have another song I'm not going to be able to pronounce. The 8th song on side 1 is Gat, G-A-T, Kirwani, I guess. This is back to the tabla drums and the sitars. It's kind of sped up and kind of a fun little song, short song. It gets a 9. So, like I said, it was a good mix of just these different types of music, and George just putting together this sort of sonic palette of the mind of music, and just sort of painting a bunch of different pictures musically on this album. Okay, we get the last song on side 1, which is called Dream Scene. It's just kind of a nuts song. It's Indian music, but it's avant-garde, experimental, psychedelic. It's got like raga chants, backwards vocals, uh, swirly bits of music that are sort of just this sunshine psychedelic pop sound to them. Then you seek into a more Western style of classical music and into sort of a jazz sound. And then toward the end of the sound, it gets really weird and just this music, concrete sound effects and weird stuff. And then it ends with church bells, like it with a cathedral in England. Is what it sounds like. And the end part of it is interesting because this came out, and George came up with this several months before John came up with Revolution Number 9. And it's interesting that John with Revolution 9 and George was the other Beatle that worked on that with him. But George was kind of there first. And whatever you think of Revolution Number 9, whether you think it's garbage or inspired or just there, it's kind of interesting that George sort of got there first, and he did. And this is just a whole bunch of kitchen sink of everything thrown in song, but it works brilliantly, and it's a great song, and it may be my favorite on the album. It gets a 10. So we flip over to side 2. We have the first song is called Party Seacombe, I guess is how you say that. Just a lazy summer day psychedelic song that sounds like film music, which makes sense because it is film music. Uh, might be the most catchy and commercial thing here. I'm not saying it's so much that if it would have been a 45, it would have gone anywhere, but probably the most accessible and catchy thing on the album. And it's another brilliant song. It gets a 10. Then we go to second song, which is called Love Scene. Just a pleasant little trip where the music carries you along nicely. Uh, I give it an 8. It's kind of interesting because he was in Bombay working with the Indian musicians, and these were classical, highly trained Indian musicians and the cream of the crop of Indian musicians at the time. But George would be telling them, "Here's what I came up with," and showing them what he wanted them to play. And they found it interesting because sometimes he had them doing just straight Indian style music, and Indian and Western music differs. I'm not a music expert, but the scales are different. There are more scales in Indian music and so forth. I don't really understand what all that means, but I know that that's the case. But a lot of times they had fun because George was having, they're trained and they're adept in playing Indian style music, and he has them playing Indian style music in a lot of cases in a Western style. So they found that interesting, and again, just goes to, he gets overshadowed by John and Paul, but just how genius and brilliant George was. And so, yeah, Love Scene's a good little bit of music. It gets an 8. Then we go to the third song, which is called Crying, which musically sounds like someone crying. Um, but then it goes into a sort of a kind of Indian, kind of Western classical mix of music, which is interesting. It's a short little piece. It doesn't add up to much, but it's pleasant and nice. I give it a 6. Fourth song is Cowboy Music, which is reminds me, sounds a bit like the Soon to Be Home segment of A Quick One While He's Away, the Who song off of their second album. Then it's got a neat droning kind of slide guitar. George, of course, was a big fan of the slide guitar. It's got a nice harmonica bit in it. It's a neat piece of music. It gets a 9. Then we go Fantasy Sequins, which starts off as Indian music and sort of goes into an Irish reel, an Irish jig type thing, and it turns into sort of a bucolic, meadow, back to nature type song, and a little bit of 20s blues and a little bit of like magical mystery era Beatles sound to it. So a whole bunch of things, just a trippy psychedelic thing, and it's a great one. It gets a 10. Glass Box is the seventh song on side 2. It's got a nice tempo, nice, I don't know, beat, I guess, for lack of a better word, or rhythm to it. Pretty little song. It gets a 9. Wonderwall to Be Here is the 8th song. It's a very classical, Western classical sounding thing, very dramatic, very uh, big boom music, cinematic, very affecting piece of music. It gets a 10. So that's the 8th song, and that gets a 10. Ninth song, it ends, and the final song is singing OM. This is how you say that. It's a chanting piece of music over an organ or a mellotron playing, which probably being played by George, I'm assuming. It's got a nice flute playing throughout it. It sounds very uh, like the pastoral bits of um, of the Pink Floyd Piper at Gates Dawn album, the Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, and I'm going to give that a 10. But this album also reminds me in parts of after Syd left Pink Floyd and the rest of the band sort of didn't know what to do until they hit it big with Dark Side of the Moon, but all those albums in between Piper and Dark Side, when they made those weird sort of head-scratching, wonderful, crazy albums of God knows where they came up with that or what they were doing. A lot of that sort of same spirit here on this, and so yeah, it's a wonderful thing in my book, and again, like I said, it's one that opinions are probably going to be divided on, because a lot of people probably listen to this and just think, oh, it's okay and that's it. And a lot of people probably are going to think this is really great. And I'm in the really great camp. I give this album a 10, and a good solo debut by George that I'm sure that kids buying this when it came out in 1968 were probably expecting Beatles stuff and pretty confused when they took this home and listened to it. But if you give it a chance, if you take the time to get into it, there's a whole lot of great music in here to be discovered. And so a big bang start for George, and one of my favorite of his albums. So check it out if you haven't.